The massive lecture hall on Kepler 442b buzzed with excitement as students from across the galaxy filled every seat. Jake Coleman adjusted his notebook and looked around at the incredible diversity surrounding him. To his left sat a tall, blue-skinned Altarian with 4 arms, busily taking notes with all of them. Behind him, a crystalline being from the Vorthax species caught light from the ceiling and threw rainbow patterns across the walls. The smell of ozone and something like cinnamon filled the air as different species breathed different atmospheres. Through their personal life support systems, Professor Zethkalar entered the hall with his usual dramatic flair. His crystalline body stood nearly 8 feet tall, with multiple faceted eyes that could focus independently. Each step he took created a soft chiming sound as his mineral-based form moved across the floor. He was famous throughout the Galactic University for his research on extreme environments and his absolute certainty about what could and could not support life. Today we discuss the most hostile environments in our galaxy, the professor announced, his voice carrying clearly through the hall's translation system. Places where no rational being would attempt to establish permanent settlements. The holographic display behind him flickered to life, showing a brilliant white landscape that stretched endlessly in all directions. Jake leaned forward with interest. The image looked familiar somehow, reminding him of pictures he had seen of salt flats on Earth. The professor continued his lecture, showing similar landscapes from dozens of worlds across the galaxy. Each image showed the same thing, vast expanses of white crystalline formations under alien suns. These are salt fields, Professor Zethkalar explained, his multiple eyes scanning the audience. Found on over 200 worlds in our database. The conditions here are absolutely lethal to carbon-based life forms. The osmotic pressure alone would drain any cellular structure within hours. The reflective properties create temperature extremes that would kill most known species in minutes. A student from the aquatic Delphina species raised a tentacle-like appendage. Professor, what about extremophile bacteria? Could they not survive in such conditions? The professor's crystalline form seemed to brighten with what Jake had learned was equivalent to a smile. An excellent question, Kira. While some microscopic life might exist briefly in the outer edges of these formations, no complex life could establish a permanent presence. The environment is simply too hostile. Any attempt to create a settlement would fail within days. Jake found himself thinking about the salt mines back on Earth. His grandfather had worked in them for 30 years. Entire towns had been built around salt deposits, with people living and working in conditions that this professor claimed were impossible. He raised his hand slowly. Yes, the human in the back, Professor Zethkalar said, his eyes focusing on Jake with obvious curiosity. Humans were still relatively new to the galactic community, and many species found their biology fascinating. Jake stood up, feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes upon him. Professor, humans have actually lived and worked in salt environments for thousands of years. We have mining communities, research stations, even cities built near salt deposits. The osmotic pressure you mentioned is manageable with proper hydration and equipment. A murmur ran through the hall. Several students turned to look at Jake with new interest. The professor's crystalline form seemed to dim slightly, which Jake had learned indicated confusion or annoyance. You speak of primitive survival techniques, Professor Zethkalar replied, his voice carrying a note of dismissal. Temporary exposure with extensive life support is hardly the same as thriving in such an environment. I am speaking of true habitability, not mere survival. Jake felt a spark of irritation. With respect, Professor, I think you might be underestimating the adaptability of carbon-based life forms. Humans have not just survived in salt environments, we have built thriving communities in them. We have learned to use the salt itself as a resource. The professor's eyes focused more intensely on Jake. Are you suggesting that my research is incorrect, human? The hall fell silent. Jake could feel his heart beating faster, but he stood his ground. I am suggesting that there might be possibilities you have not considered. Humans have a saying. Where there is a will, there is a way. Professor Zethkalar moved closer to Jake's section of the hall. Interesting. You believe that willpower alone can overcome the fundamental laws of chemistry and physics? I believe that creative problem-solving can find solutions that pure theory might miss, Jake replied. Sometimes you have to actually try something to know if it works. The professor stood silent for a long moment, his crystalline form catching and reflecting light in complex patterns. Finally he spoke. Very well, human. I will give you an opportunity to prove your theory. There is an abandoned research station on Saltos Prime, a planet covered entirely in salt formations. The previous team evacuated 6 months ago when their equipment began failing due to the hostile conditions. Jake felt his stomach drop slightly, but he kept his expression steady. What exactly are you proposing, Professor? I propose a challenge, the professor announced, his voice carrying clearly through the hall. You will travel to Saltos Prime and establish a functioning research station in the salt fields. Not mere survival, but a thriving operation that can sustain itself indefinitely. If you succeed, I will publicly acknowledge that my research was incomplete. If you fail, you will admit that human arrogance led you to challenge established scientific fact. The hall erupted in excited whispers. Jake's friend Kira looked at him with concern, her large aquatic eyes showing worry. Other students leaned forward with interest, sensing that they were witnessing something significant. Jake took a deep breath. He thought about his grandfather in the salt mines, about human settlements in the Sahara Desert, about the countless times throughout history when humans had been told something was impossible only to prove otherwise. I accept your challenge, Professor. Professor Zethkalar's form brightened again. Excellent. I will arrange transport to Saltos Prime within the week. You will have access to the abandoned station and its remaining equipment. The university will monitor your progress, and we will evaluate your success or failure after a period of 3 months. As the professor dismissed the class, students surrounded Jake with questions and concerns. Some seemed excited by the prospect of seeing a human attempt the impossible. Others clearly thought he had made a terrible mistake. Through it all, Jake felt a growing sense of determination. He had just committed himself to proving that humans could thrive. Where the galaxy's experts said life was impossible, Kira approached him as the crowd thinned. Jake, are you sure about this? Saltos Prime has defeated every research team that has tried to establish a permanent presence there. Jake smiled at his friend. That just means no one has found the right approach yet. Besides, humans have a terrible habit of refusing to accept the word impossible. He gathered his notes and headed toward the exit, already beginning to plan his approach to the challenge ahead. The transport ship Meridian dropped out of hyperspace with a gentle shudder that Jake felt through his boots. Captain Lisa Rodriguez called back from the pilot's seat, her voice carrying easily through the small cargo bay. First look at your new home, Jake. Hope you brought sunglasses. Jake moved to the viewport and immediately understood what she meant. Saltos Prime stretched below them like a massive white diamond, its surface catching and reflecting the system's twin suns in blinding patterns. The entire planet appeared to be covered in crystalline formations that created an endless field of brilliant white. No oceans, no green patches, no signs of any life at all. Previous research teams called it the mirror world, Lisa continued, as she guided the ship toward the planet's surface. The salt formations are so reflective that you can see the landing approach from orbit. Makes navigation easy, but living there is another story entirely. As they descended through the thin atmosphere, Jake could see the abandoned research station growing larger below them. It looked like a small dark island in an ocean of white, its metal structures standing out starkly against the salt formations. Solar panels covered most of the buildings. Though many appeared damaged or covered in salt deposits, the ship touched down on a prepared landing pad with a soft thud. Jake gathered his equipment bags and followed Lisa to the airlock. She handed him a pair of specially tinted goggles and a breathing mask. Atmosphere is breathable, but the salt particles can irritate your lungs. The glare will blind you without protection. Jake stepped out onto the surface of Saltos Prime and immediately felt the heat reflecting up from the white ground. Even through His protective gear, the brightness, was overwhelming. The salt formations stretched in all directions, creating a landscape that looked like frozen waves. Some formations stood several feet tall, twisted into strange shapes by wind and temperature. Changes. "Welcome to paradise," a voice called from the research station. A man in a dusty work suit approached them, his face protected by a wide-brimmed hat and goggles. "I am Pete Walsh, maintenance engineer. I've been keeping this place running." "While we waited for you," Jake shook the man's hand. "How bad is the situation, really?" Pete gestured toward the station buildings. "Come inside and I will show you. The salt here is not just regular table salt. It is a mixture of different minerals that corrode everything they touch. We have been fighting a losing battle against equipment failure for months." They walked toward the main building, their boots crunching on the crystalline surface. Jake noticed that the salt formations were not uniform. Some areas showed different colors and textures, suggesting various mineral compositions. The patterns reminded him of geological surveys he had studied back on Earth, inside the station. Pete led them to a control room filled with blinking displays and humming machinery. "This is ALEX, our station AI. He will brief you on the current situation." A calm synthetic voice filled the room. "Hello, Jake Coleman. I am Automated Life Support and Experimental Expert System. Current station status is critical. Main fusion reactor is operating at 60% efficiency due to salt contamination in the cooling systems. Backup generators have 4 days of fuel remaining. External communications are offline due to corrosion in the antenna array." Jake studied the displays showing power consumption and generation. "What happened to the previous research team? Dr. Ben Carter and his team evacuated?" 6 months ago, Pete explained. "Their mission was to study the mineral composition of the salt fields, but the environment proved too hostile for long-term occupation. Equipment failures mounted faster than they could repair them. The final straw was when the reactor started showing signs of critical damage." Alex added more information. "The salt particles in the atmosphere are extremely fine and penetrate even sealed systems. They cause electrical shorts, corrode metal components, and clog air filtration systems. Previous teams have attempted various protective measures, but none proved effective long-term." Jake walked to a window that looked out over the salt fields. The landscape seemed to shift and shimmer in the heat, creating patterns that were almost hypnotic. "Has anyone studied the electrical properties of these formations?" Pete looked puzzled. "Electrical properties? They're just salt deposits. Why would that matter?" "Salt is an excellent conductor when dissolved in water," Jake explained. "But these formations might have other properties we have not considered. Different minerals, different conductivity rates, different chemical reactions." Lisa, who had been quiet during the briefing, spoke up. "Jake, I have to leave for my next delivery run in 2 hours. Are you sure you want to stay here? This place has defeated every team that has tried to establish a permanent presence." Jake continued studying the salt formations through the window. Something about their structure intrigued him. The layers and patterns suggested natural processes that might be more complex than simple evaporation. "I need to get out there and take some samples." "Pete, do you have geological survey equipment?" "Some basic tools," Pete replied. "But I should warn you, extended exposure to the salt fields is dangerous. The reflected heat can cause severe burns, and the salt particles can damage your breathing even with protective gear." Jake nodded, still watching the landscape. "I understand the risks, but I think we might be looking at this problem from the wrong angle. Everyone has been trying to fight the environment instead of working with it." Alex spoke again. "Jake Coleman, I should inform you that the previous team's geological surveys are available in my database. They cataloged 17 different mineral compounds in the salt formations, including lithium, sodium, potassium, and several rare earth elements." Jake turned away from the window with sudden interest. "Lithium? Are you certain about that?" "Confirmed. Lithium chloride concentrations of up to 12% in some formations. Dr. Carter's team noted it as an interesting discovery, but saw no practical applications for their mission. Jake felt excitement building in his chest. Lithium was a key component in battery technology. If the salt fields contained natural deposits of lithium along with other conductive minerals, the implications could be enormous. Pete, I need to get out there and take some detailed samples. The sooner the better. Pete looked concerned. The heat will be worst in about 2 hours when both suns reach their peak. You should wait until evening when the temperature drops. Actually, I want to see how the formations react to peak heat, Jake said. If I am right about this, the temperature changes might be exactly what we need. Lisa checked her chronometer. I really do need to leave soon. Last chance to change your mind and come back to civilization. Jake smiled at her through his protective goggles. Thanks, but I think I'm going to like it here. This place might be exactly what I need to prove that humans can thrive anywhere. As Lisa prepared to leave, Jake gathered the geological equipment and prepared for his first real exploration of the salt fields. The landscape that had defeated every previous team might just hold the key to solving their power problems. He had a theory forming in his mind, and he was eager to test it against the harsh reality of Saltos Prime. Jake stepped out into the blazing heat of Saltos Prime with his geological equipment bag slung over his shoulder. The twin suns hung directly overhead, turning the salt fields into a furnace of reflected light and heat. Even through his protective gear, he could feel the intensity of the environment that had driven away every previous research team. Pete Walsh followed him reluctantly, carrying additional sample containers and a portable shade shelter. You sure about this timing? The temperature out here is hitting 120 degrees Fahrenheit. That is exactly why I want to be out here now, Jake replied, kneeling beside a formation that rose about 3 feet from the ground. I want to see how these deposits react to peak heat conditions. Jake began chipping samples from different layers of the formation. The salt came away in crystalline chunks that showed distinct color variations. Some layers were pure white. Others had hints of blue or green, and a few showed a metallic gray tint that caught his attention immediately. Look at this, Jake said, holding up a sample with gray streaks running through it. This is not just sodium chloride. These metal traces suggest we are looking at a much more complex chemical composition. Pete set up the shade shelter and pulled out a handheld analyzer. Dr. Carter's team found 17 different compounds, but they never explained why they were layered this way. The formations look almost like sedimentary rock, but formed from evaporated solutions instead of compressed materials. Jake moved to another formation about 20 feet away and took more samples. The layering pattern was different here, with more of the metallic gray material and less of the pure white crystals. Pete, do you have any idea how these formations were created? The previous team's theory was that this planet once had vast oceans that evaporated over millions of years, Pete explained. Different minerals crystallized at different rates, creating the layered effect. But that does not explain why the formations are so uniform across the entire planet. Jake stood up and looked across the salt fields with new understanding. If the formations were created by evaporation, then the different layers represented different stages in the process. The most soluble minerals would have crystallized last, creating the top layers, while the least soluble would have formed the bottom layers. Pete, I need you to help me with something, Jake said, his excitement growing. I want to test the electrical conductivity of these different layers. Pete looked puzzled. Electrical conductivity? Why would that matter for a geological survey? Because I think we might be looking at a natural battery, Jake explained. If these formations contain different metals and electrolytes in layered structures, they might be capable of generating electrical current. They spent the next 2 hours taking samples from formations across a wide area. Jake noticed that the patterns were remarkably consistent, suggesting that the same geological processes had occurred planet-wide. The metallic gray layers appeared in the same relative positions in every formation they tested back at the station. Jake immediately began testing his samples with the laboratory equipment. Pete watched with growing interest as Jake dissolved small amounts of each sample in distilled water and tested the resulting solutions with electrical probes. "The gray layers are loaded with lithium," Jake announced. "And look at this, the blue-tinted layers contain high concentrations of copper sulfate. The green layers have zinc compounds." Pete leaned over Jake's shoulder to look at the readouts. "Those are all components used in battery construction." "Are you saying these salt formations are natural batteries?" "Not exactly," Jake replied, moving to another piece of equipment. "But they contain all the raw materials needed to create batteries. More importantly, they might be able to generate current through natural electrochemical processes." Jake set up a simple experiment using samples from different layers. He placed electrodes made from copper and zinc into solutions created from the various salt samples. Within minutes, the voltmeter showed a steady current flow. "It works," Jake sighed quietly. "The different mineral layers are creating electrical potential differences. We are generating current from dissolved salt samples." Pete stared at the equipment in amazement. "But this is just a tiny amount of material. How could we scale this up to power the entire station?" Jake was already thinking ahead. "The formations outside are massive. If we could create a network of electrodes buried in the salt at different depths, we could tap into the natural electrical potential of the entire planet." Over the next several days, Jake and Pete worked together to test Jake's theory. They discovered that the salt formations contained natural water content that increased during the cooler night hours. The daily temperature cycle created convection currents within the formations that enhanced the electrochemical reactions. "The planet itself is like a giant battery," Jake explained to ALEX during one of their evening briefings. "The salt formations contain all the necessary components, and the temperature changes create the conditions needed for current generation." Alex processed this information. "Jake Coleman, your theory is intriguing, but the power requirements of this station are substantial. A few small electrochemical cells would not be sufficient." Jake smiled. "That is why we are going to build a distributed network. Instead of a few large batteries, we will create thousands of small collection points spread across the salt fields. The combined output should be more than enough to power the station." Pete looked skeptical. "Jake, that would require running conductors across miles of salt formations. The corrosion problems alone would be enormous." "Not if we use the right materials," Jake replied. "The salt formations themselves can serve as both the electrolyte and the conductor. We just need to create collection points at optimal locations and link them together." Jake spent the next week mapping the electrical potential of formations across a 5-mile radius around the station. He discovered that certain formations generated more current than others, and that the output varied predictably with temperature and humidity changes. "The key is understanding the natural patterns," Jake explained to Pete as they installed their first full-scale test electrode. "The formations are not random. They follow geological rules that we can predict and use to our advantage." The test electrode consisted of a series of metal rods driven into different layers of a large formation. Copper conductors connected the rods to a collection unit that consolidated the electrical output. Within hours of installation, they were generating enough current to power the station's emergency lighting system. "It actually works," Pete said, staring at the power readings. "We are generating electricity from salt formations that everyone said were completely lifeless." Jake nodded, watching the steady current flow on the monitoring equipment. "This is just the beginning. If we can prove that this system works reliably, we might be able to power entire cities using nothing but salt fields and smart engineering." As night fell over Saltos Prime, Jake stood outside the station and looked across the salt formations with new appreciation. What had seemed like a barren wasteland was actually a vast energy source waiting to be tapped. He had found a way to make the impossible environment work for human civilization instead of against it. Jake stood in the control room 3 weeks later, watching the power displays with satisfaction. The salt battery network now extended in all directions from the research station, creating a web of collection points that drew electricity from the planet's natural formations. The main power grid showed steady green indicators across all systems for the first time in months. Alex, give me a status report on all systems, Jake requested, checking his daily logs. All primary systems operating at full capacity, the AI responded. Fusion reactor has been switched to standby mode. Salt battery network is providing 112% of current power requirements. Excess energy is being stored in the backup systems. Pete Walsh walked into the control room carrying a cup of coffee and shaking his head in amazement. Jake, I've been working on power systems for 15 years, and I never thought I would see the day when we could run a research station entirely on electricity generated from salt deposits. Jake smiled as he updated his research notes. The best part is that the system is actually getting more efficient as we expand it. Each new collection point we add increases the total output by more than its individual contribution. The communication system chimed with an incoming message. Jake activated the display and saw the face of communications engineer Kate Sullivan appearing on the screen. She had arrived 2 days ago to help restore the station's long-range communication systems. Jake, we have got incoming traffic from the Galactic University, Kate announced. Professor Zethkalar is requesting a status update on your progress. He wants to know if you are ready to admit failure and request evacuation. Jake laughed. Tell the professor that we are doing better than expected. In fact, invite him too. Come see our progress for himself. Kate looked surprised. Are you sure about that? He is not exactly expecting you to succeed. That is exactly why I want him to see this, Jake replied. Sometimes the best way to change someone's mind is to show them the impossible actually working. Over the next several days, Jake and his team worked to prepare for the professor's visit. They expanded the salt battery network to cover an area of 10 square miles around the station. Each collection point fed into a central distribution system that could power not just the research station but potentially an entire city. Biologist Rick Martinez arrived on the supply shuttle that brought additional equipment. He had volunteered to study the environmental impact of Jake's salt battery system. Within hours of his arrival, he made a discovery that surprised everyone. Jake, you need to see this, Rick called from outside the station. The salt battery system is not just providing power. It is creating microenvironments that are actually supporting life. Jake joined Rick at one of the collection points. The metal electrodes had been in place for 2 weeks, and the area around them showed signs of change. Small patches of green material grew near the base of the electrodes, and the salt formations themselves seemed to have a different texture. These are extremophile bacteria, Rick explained, showing Jake samples under a portable microscope. The electrochemical reactions from your battery system are creating conditions that allow these organisms to thrive. You are not just powering the station, you are creating the conditions for life itself. Jake stared at the microscopic organisms in amazement. The professor said that complex life could never exist in salt formations. But we are not just surviving here, we are helping life flourish. 3 days later, the transport ship Meridian returned to Saltos Prime carrying Professor Zethkalar and a team of scientists from the Galactic University. Jake watched from the observation deck as the ship approached the landing pad, its hull reflecting the brilliant light from the salt fields. Professor Zethkalar emerged from the ship with his usual dramatic presence, his crystalline form catching and reflecting light in complex patterns. He was followed by 5 other scientists representing different species and specialties. Jake could see the skepticism in their body language as they looked around at the salt formations. Welcome to Saltos Prime, Professor, Jake said as he met the group at the airlock. I hope you are prepared to see something that will change your understanding of what is possible in extreme environments. The professor's multiple eyes focused on Jake with obvious doubt. Human, I have come here expecting to arrange your evacuation from this hostile environment. I hope you have not allowed pride to endanger your safety. Jake led the group into the station, which was now brightly lit and fully operational. The visitors looked around in surprise at the obvious signs of a thriving research facility. Equipment hummed efficiently, displays showed optimal readings, and the air circulation systems worked perfectly. Alex, please give our guests a full status report, Jake requested. All systems operational and exceeding design specifications, the AI announced. Power generation from the salt battery network is currently running at 130% of station requirements. Environmental systems are functioning perfectly. Long-range communications are fully restored. Dr. Vextela, a reptilian scientist from the Saurian Collective, spoke in a voice filled with disbelief. This is impossible. Our surveys showed that this station was failing when the previous team evacuated, Jake smiled. That was before we learned to work with the environment instead of fighting against it. Let me show you how the salt battery system works. Jake led the group outside to the nearest collection point. The metal electrodes rose from the salt formations like strange monuments, connected by heavy cables that ran back toward the station. Monitoring equipment showed steady current flow and voltage readings. The salt formations contain layers of different minerals that create natural electrical potential, Jake explained. By placing electrodes at different depths, we can tap into the planet's natural electrochemical reactions. The daily temperature cycle drives convection currents that enhance the process. Professor Zethkalar examined the equipment with growing interest. His crystalline form seemed to pulse with different colors as he processed the information. You are claiming that these barren salt fields can generate sufficient electricity to power a research station. More than sufficient, Jake replied. We are currently generating excess power that we store for future use. The system is scalable. We could power an entire city using the same principles. Rick Martinez joined the group carrying his biological samples. Professor, there is something else you should see. The salt battery system is not just providing power, it is creating conditions that support life. Rick showed the group his microscope. Samples of the extremophile bacteria. The visiting scientists gathered around the equipment with growing excitement. What they were seeing challenged fundamental assumptions about life in extreme environments. These organisms are thriving in conditions that our textbooks say are impossible, Dr. Vextela observed. The human has not just survived in this environment, he has created a system that supports new forms of life. Professor Zethkalar stood silent for a long moment, his crystalline form reflecting the light from the salt fields in complex patterns. Finally he spoke. Human, I must admit that what you have accomplished here challenges everything I thought I knew about extreme environments. You have proven that with sufficient creativity and determination, even the most hostile conditions can be transformed into opportunities. Jake felt a surge of satisfaction as he watched the professor's rigid certainty begin to crack. Thank you, Professor. Sometimes the impossible is just another engineering problem waiting for the right solution. 6 months later, Jake stood in the same lecture hall on Kepler 442b where his journey had begun. The massive auditorium was packed even fuller than before, with scientists from across the galaxy eager to hear about what the galactic news networks had dubbed the Saltfield Miracle. Representatives from dozens of species filled every seat, and remote viewers from distant worlds had connected through the university's communication network. Jake looked out at the audience and spotted familiar faces. Kira sat in the front row, her aquatic features showing obvious pride in her friend's achievement. Professor Zethkalar occupied a place of honor on the faculty panel, his crystalline form reflecting the stage lights in brilliant patterns. Pete Walsh and Rick Martinez had traveled from Saltos Prime to attend the presentation, along with Kate Sullivan and several other team members. 6 months ago, I sat in this same hall and heard Professor Zethkalar declare that no complex life could survive in salt formations, Jake began, his voice carrying clearly through the translation systems. Today, I want to share with you what we discovered when we decided to test that assumption. The holographic display behind Jake came to life, showing images of Saltos Prime as it appeared now. The abandoned research station had been transformed into a thriving complex with multiple buildings and expanded facilities. The salt fields around it were dotted with collection points connected by power lines, creating a web of energy that stretched to the horizon. The key to our success was understanding that the salt formations were not obstacles to overcome, but resources to utilize, Jake explained. Instead of fighting the environment, we learn to work with its natural properties. Jake showed detailed diagrams of the salt battery system, explaining how the layered mineral deposits created natural electrical potential. The audience leaned forward with interest as he described the electrochemical processes that allowed them to generate power from the planet's surface. The salt formations contain everything needed for large-scale energy production, Jake continued. Lithium, copper, zinc, and other conductive materials layered in natural patterns that create electrical gradients. By understanding these patterns, we could tap into the planet's natural energy. A scientist from the insectoid Manthari species raised a multi-jointed arm. Human Jake, what was your total power output compared to conventional fusion systems? Our salt battery network now generates 40% more power than a standard fusion reactor of equivalent size, Jake replied. More importantly, it requires no fuel inputs and produces no waste products. The system is completely sustainable. The audience buzzed with excited conversations. Jake could see representatives from mining companies and energy corporations taking detailed notes. The implications of cheap, sustainable power generation were obvious to everyone present. Dr. Vextala, who had visited Saltos Prime with Professor Zethkalar, stood to address the audience. I must add that the human's achievement goes beyond near power generation. The salt battery system has created microenvironments that support previously unknown forms of extremophile life. We are seeing evolution in action. Jake nodded toward the reptilian scientist. That was an unexpected discovery. The electrochemical reactions create conditions that allow organisms to thrive in environments we thought were completely sterile. We are not just surviving in extreme conditions, we are helping life flourish there. Professor Zethkalar rose from his position on the faculty panel. His crystalline form seemed brighter than usual as he addressed the audience. I must publicly acknowledge that my previous research was incomplete. The human J. Coleman has demonstrated that with sufficient creativity and determination, environments I declared uninhabitable can be transformed into thriving centers of activity. The professor paused, his multiple eyes focusing on Jake. More importantly, he has taught me that scientific certainty must always be balanced with openness to new possibilities. Sometimes the most valuable discoveries come from those willing to challenge established assumptions. Jake felt a surge of satisfaction at the professor's words. Thank you, Professor. I think the key lesson here is the importance of diverse perspectives in scientific research. My human background gave me a different way of looking at the salt formations, just as your crystalline nature provides insights that carbon-based species might miss. The presentation continued with detailed technical specifications and implementation strategies. Jake showed how the salt battery technology could be adapted to other worlds with similar mineral formations. Survey teams had already identified over 50 candidate planets where the system could be deployed. The most exciting aspect is the scalability, Jake explained. A single collection point can power a small outpost. A network like ours on Saltos Prime can support a major research facility. Expand the system planet-wide, and you could power entire colonial settlements. An elegant delegate from the Ethereal Lumina Collective asked about environmental impact. Human Jake, does your system cause permanent changes to the salt formations? The formations actually regenerate themselves through natural geological processes, Jake replied. Our monitoring shows that areas we have been harvesting for months continue to produce steady power output. The system appears to be truly sustainable. After the formal presentation ended, Jake was surrounded by interested scientists and potential collaborators. Representatives from the Colonial Development Authority wanted to discuss implementing the technology on frontier worlds. Energy companies inquired about licensing agreements. Academic institutions offered research partnerships. Through the crowd, Jake saw Kira approaching with a broad smile. Jake, I am so proud of what you have accomplished. You have changed how the entire galaxy thinks about extreme environments. Jake smiled back at his friend. It feels strange to think that this all started with a simple disagreement in a lecture hall. I never expected it to lead to this. Professor Zethkalar joined their conversation, his crystalline form pulsing with colors Jake had learned indicated excitement. Human Jake, I have a proposal for you. The university is creating a new department of extreme environment solutions. We would like you to head this department. Jake felt surprised by the offer. Professor, I am honored, but I am not sure I am qualified to run an entire academic department. Your qualifications are precisely what we need, the professor replied. You have demonstrated the ability to see possibilities where others see only obstacles. That perspective is exactly what the galaxy needs as we expand into more challenging environments. Jake looked around the lecture hall at the diverse gathering of scientists and researchers. Representatives from dozens of species had come together to learn about human ingenuity and adaptability. The salt battery technology was already being planned for implementation on worlds across the galaxy. I accept your offer, Professor, Jake said finally. But I want to make sure the department focuses on practical solutions that help people build better lives in challenging places. As the crowd began to disperse, Jake remained on the stage looking out at the nearly empty lecture hall. 6 months ago, he had been a simple exchange student challenging his professor's assumptions. Now he was heading a new academic department dedicated to making the impossible possible. Pete Walsh joined him on the stage. So what is our next impossible challenge, Jake? Jake smiled, thinking about the reports he had read of frozen methane. Worlds and high radiation environments that no one had successfully colonized. There are plenty of places out there that the experts say cannot support human life. I think it is time we prove them wrong again. The lecture hall lights dimmed as the cleaning crew prepared the space for the next presentation. Jake gathered his materials and headed toward the exit, already planning the next phase of humanity's expansion into the galaxy's most challenging environments. The impossible had become possible, and that was just the beginning.